morning, everybody. I think I wore the wrong lanyard. I was thinking of, I had no idea there was like a code for them, I picked the red one because I thought it was a cool color. It's a pleasure being here, and I get to talk about my favorite subject, which is, sort of AI in healthcare. And the way I came to actually working in the data science field, including AI in healthcare, is really a personal journey. My husband got diagnosed with cancer many years ago, and I always get emotional when I think about that moment when he got diagnosed. Ended up having his results sent to one hospital. The hospital did their regular radiologic sort of assessment, really didn't pick up anything. I ended up having his results sent to Mount Sinai, and later on, and I'll talk about Mount Sinai as well as Memorial Sloan Kettering. At that time, a few years ago, they were doing some really amazing research where they're incorporating AI in radiologic research. And during that time, what the AI picked up, the radiologists didn't. And it took 8 months between when he went first initially to the doctor and when the AI picked it up. Obviously, there was an 8-month delay before his treatment began. And I always go back to thinking, what would have happened if those tools were available at the first hospital? What would the treatment outcome have been if he had 8 months worth of treatment, which he didn't have? So I always start prefacing that these technologies do make changes, life and death changes, and I'm a good example of that. So let's see if this clicker works. Perfect. So in order to understand the journey, it's really important to think about where we have been and how does AI apply to the healthcare setting, sort of looking at the past to ground ourselves. And then looking at the technologies currently, what does it look like within the healthcare sphere? And then the fun and the cool part is really, this is where my kids, kind of live in the world of the future. Mom, look at this technology and look at that technology. And I'm always in awe as far as what's out there in the field. And obviously, we have to couch everything within ethics and ensuring they're doing the right thing, especially in the healthcare and regulated fields. And then we'll talk about some conclusions and lessons learned. Because I'm an academic, I usually start with my learning objectives for every class, as you probably are fully aware. So I will begin with reviewing some important components as far as AI in healthcare, current applications. I'm going to talk about the impact of commercialization. I've been thinking a lot about sort of open AI as well as how the field is kind of progressing, including having different types of sectors coming in. And just thinking about the ramifications of corporations as well as public and public sectors, as well as academia has in this role. Okay. So this is a cool image that I tried my hand. I was telling Michaela I failed at it. This is an image from DALL-E. I was playing around trying to figure out, can AI create cool images? My kids are way better than I am to do this. My daughter's like, Mom, forget that. Go into Discord. Use the other one. I can't remember the name. It does a better job with kind of, doing the hand thing. I was trying to convey a doctor in healthcare. And this is what popped up when I ended up, putting that into the chat, is usually a robot and sort of like a cool image in the background. But what I really want to emphasize is that we don't want to take the human out of the loop. The human is key in healthcare. There are certain things that we as people still can do that machines will never be able to do. So for me, I think AI has definitely the ability to transform healthcare. Is a tool, it's an aid, just like a stethoscope, but it's not going to replace us. Well, that's what I like to think because I'm in the healthcare field, so I'm like, I'll be out of a job if, it gets really good with mental health. And now we do see some of the chatbots are way better. My daughter says that her chatbot provides better mental health advice than I do, and I'm a licensed therapist. So that kind of really jabbed me. I was like, how dare you? All those years of training. She's like, Mom, it's great summarization of large-scale data. You tend to forget. And I'm like, that's true. A lot of these machines don't forget. We are fallible. We tend to forget. I tend to forget. So I think it's also important to think about sometimes it's good if you do forget, that good things and bad things. So let's move on to next slide. All right. When I think about sort of the entire totality of, how do we kind of go down the path of AI? Why even create a synthetic type of approach to address our issues? How do we come about? And I think it's really important to sort of look at long-term history. You don't have to look at all the specifics. I think the slides are available. And I was even thinking about before Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage with their, computing machine. Can we go even further back as far as really thinking about what are the tenets of, AI and artificial intelligence or any sort of intelligence? So when you look at the trajectory of AI development, we can argue that it goes further back in time. I mean, that's what a lot of philosophers argue. Some argue that modern AI can be traced to classical philosophers' attempts to describe human thinking as a symbolic system. So again, describe human thinking as a symbolic system. I mean, language is a symbolic system. So that's where you have natural language processing, taking advance and enhancing that. But taking human thinking, I think that's really instructive and unique, that in a way we're modeling human thinking, human approach. And obviously that's, currently with artificial intelligence, we could see that with deep learning. So when you look at deep learning, that kind of attests to that early thinking as far as, are we taking human thinking in a human brain and kind of mapping it? So as a general concept, I think that's really important to keep in the back of your mind. So in order for AI to kind of take hold, the history of AI is important. So it started early in the 1950s to the as far as, kind of coining at Stanford, the whole concept of artificial intelligence. And then we're moving into sort of 1970s to the 1980s. We have what's called the AI winter, very little development, as well as investment. But since the 1990s and moving forward, we've seen a huge progress as far as investment in artificial intelligence, including the different applications and applications especially within the healthcare sector. So there's, as everybody knows so far, there's 5 different categories: vision, voice, natural language, algorithms, and hardware. On the vision aspect of it, I think this is really unique, especially current work that my colleagues are doing at Stanford. Looking at Google Glass and looking at different types of algorithms, especially with autism research. What they're really doing is taking the research that is being done in this field, I apologize, and looking at different emotional states and how do you respond accordingly, which is pretty novel kind of research looking at how do you apply AI within vision. The second one is really sort of speech-to-text analysis. The next one, obviously, with ChatGPT, the natural language processing. And then looking at, for the fourth one, how do we use algorithms to write code? And the last one with IoT and smart devices. When I look at the field of AI and different application types, I'm looking at the 10 different categories: conversational AI, recommendation engine. I know everybody loves their Netflix and ensuring that they get the sort of the right constructs as far as the different shows they're watching. Time series forecasting, predictive analytics, which are really important in the healthcare sector, as well as image recognition, as I mentioned before with my case example. Machine vision and identifying different objects, smart systems, and we have autonomous systems, robotic process automation with automating repetitive tasks, fraud detection, and then the most important one I think that AI has the greatest impact, which is the healthcare sector. So none of this would be possible without, obviously, big data, right? Do you guys agree? I think a lot of work in big data has been essential to ensure that it lays the foundation for artificial intelligence application. It's closely linked with any of the developments, and having really robust data that includes variability, variety, velocity, as well as volume of the type of data. And another really important thing, having the great amount of information to train a lot of these models has been key to ensuring the greater sensitivity and specificity in reducing error rates within the applications. So now we're going to move more into my area, is sort of thinking about what are the current development of AI in healthcare, which spans multiple fields: radiology, therapeutics. There has been a lot of work in disease detection, as well as public health. I think we saw the use of AI during COVID. And then my personal favorite is really mental health. Some of the work that's being done currently to detect depression, anxiety among students, as well as individuals with severe mental illness. So why focus on AI in healthcare? From this graph from Grand U Research, we could see that it's a $10.4 billion industry. It's a pretty large industry. So, and it's expected to grow by another $4 billion by 2024. So there's a lot of money to be had in healthcare. So you see a lot of investments, you see a proliferation with different organizations kind of coming into the fore. So again, from 2020 to 2030, we see a 40% increase as far as not only investment, but as well as return on that investment. So what we see is that healthcare is definitely ripe for change, number one, but the way we receive healthcare, including the investments that are made in this market. Recently, I was looking at the different types of healthcare startups because I was interested as far as who's doing what out there in the field. And what is really interesting is that there's 10 different domains. So this is from CB Insights. And the proliferation is across the board, from drug discovery to predictive analytics. There's a lot of work and risk scoring, especially in large-scale hospitals, genomics research, fitness and nutrition. That's my favorite, especially, you know, I see those ads for Noom and everything else, and I'm like, you have wonderful algorithms behind that kind of allow people to stay on track. Another huge sector is hospital decision support and compliance. Virtual assistants, there has been a huge proliferation as far as virtual assistant. Again, remote monitoring, that now we are going back to the old times and old models where you want to receive care in your home rather than actually going to a hospital. That also reduces nosocomial or hospital-based infections. I hate hospitals, just from my personal experience. So staying home and getting that care, I think, is absolutely important. And then, you know, as researchers, I think AI is also primed to change clinical trials. And obviously, I think the biggest help, because that's my area of research, is really mental health. So the early researchers, obviously, you know, the pioneering technologies that they kind of lay the foundation for what's to come. And they had to overcome many, many challenges. For example, computing power. I think you're holding smartphones that are way smaller and have greater computing power than the early explorers within the field of AI. And it always boggles me that this tiny machine was, you know, in the olden times, it was the size of big IBM room. So I think that's really important. We have vast amounts of data, especially with the internet. So the proliferation of data and the types of data makes this field possible. So I'm going to provide two examples as far as early application in healthcare. And this started in the 1960s, and there's plenty of other examples. These are just two among many. One is Dendrol, and both of these were developed at Stanford. I think Stanford was like a hub for data science. One was to analyze mass spectrometry data, Dendrol, and infer possible chemical structures of organic compounds. And it did a pretty good job sort of, you know, analyzing vast amounts of data and breaking down the results pretty quickly. The other one was Mycin, also developed at Stanford. I believe Lisp was used as the coding. And it's a backward chaining expert system used to identify bacteria that cause severe infection. And what's really interesting is that this application was able to, so basically the way the algorithm worked, you ask several questions, and it provided a list of possible diagnoses. And it was primarily designed to diagnose bacterial infections, specifically for bacterial meningitis. And there's a reason they've used sort of the ENCODE mycin for, you know, any sort of antibiotic-resistant treatment approach. And what they really found is that this application was able to pretty quickly not only target the potential bacterial infection, but it outperformed a lot of the human doctors. So you see this differential between what the machine can do as far as looking at patterns versus what a human can do. So what we have learned from, sort of past lessons? I think one of the important things is that innovation requires perseverance. Any sort of graduate student or anybody in data science requires perseverance in order to ensure that they're moving forward. We've demonstrated that the role of AI in diagnosis is paramount, and that the systems are able to detect and perform better than humans. And obviously, the power of data does have an impact as far as outcomes. So what is the current role of AI in healthcare? There's plenty of real-world applications now that the AI has been applied. Obviously, the most important, I think, for me, is enhancing patient care and diagnostics. There has been a lot of work in AI in healthcare administration. When I look at the AI benefits, sort of like the circle as far as what does it look like, early detection with cancer research, there has been a lot of work in there, diagnosis, decision-making, and augmenting human decision-making, as well as what are the different types of treatment approaches and narrowing that down. Another really interesting thing is that recently there has been a lot of work for end-of-life care in using these applications to support individuals that are elderly keep functioning. The role in research and training physicians is also important. So as far as different AI use cases, I break them down usually in 4 different categories. One is detection and diagnosis. So, for example, detecting eye disease from scans, or detecting malignant tumors, prediction of mental health disorders, that's another area. For intervention and treatment, we have cancer radiotherapy treatment, genotype-guided treatment, especially now with CRISPR. We've seen a lot of a combination between biotechnology as well as AI. In prognosis and maintenance, sort of predicting if a patient is gonna deteriorate, and what to do and how to intervene. And then for process improvements, I think there's 2 separate categories, looking at patient wait times. I hate going to the emergency room of the hospital and sitting there for hours and hours. And I always wish that there was like something that can be done to, route very differently so you're not sitting there, but you're being seen. So there's a lot of work, using queuing theory. How do you do this? And AI has definitely been a key role in ensuring that that helps with coming up with different scenarios as far as how to reduce patient wait times. And then I think another really important component, especially with large healthcare systems, is really looking at all of the wealth of data that's available within electronic health records. And what do you do with that data? How do you mine that data? How do you improve outcomes by looking at the information and segmenting the populations? Recently, a colleague of mine sent me a note. She's like, have you seen, the World Health Organization launched the most extensive study of, they were looking at how do you bring in digital assistants to support the shortages of healthcare workers across the globe. So they're working with, I think, a company called Soul Machines, and they're looking at to create digital AI health workers. And this is to augment the community health workers that are in the field, which I thought was pretty novel that, having this technology work that way. Obviously, for the current application, this is just one list, but there's, the list is getting longer and longer by the minute. So having, chatbots and digital people kind of be the primary care triage, where the information gets collected, especially critical information, surveys, other things, vitals, and virtual vitals as well. Then routing that to a professional to kind of take it to the next step. Administrative workflow assistance, as I mentioned, can save organization over $18 billion if done correctly, that in a way it optimizes healthcare processes. And a lot of the organizations are moving to digitizing their systems. So, digitally mapping organizational processes, creating digital twins, and then optimizing that using different types of intelligences, especially AI. The drug discovery will cover, including optimization of clinical trials. I think this is an area that we spend a lot of time and energy, and it's really important to think about what are the different types of methodologies and approaches that we could use to come with insights, especially with clinical trials. There's 2 other real-world applications. I remember watching IBM and, IBM Watson, and having this artificial intelligence win Jeopardy, and I'm a huge Jeopardy fan, so this was so exciting for me. I'm like, oh my God, look, it knows all the answers. But I'm like, of course it knows all the answers. It has a huge data bank of all the questions and answers. Of course it's going to get it right, which I thought was interesting. So AI does really well with sort of memory and retention and ensuring that it picks up patterns. So in this case, for IBM, Watson for Oncology, is a prime example of how AI is transforming the field of cancer care. And they're doing some really innovative work in this field and kind of calling through the vast majority of medical literature, especially of cancer care, and coming up with the most optimal solutions for patients. The second example is Google's DeepMind. So this is an application that analyzes retinal scans to detect diabetic retinopathy. So basically, it's used to improve individuals' or patients' lives with diabetes. So this is an example of this application in practice, and there was a recent sort of Google research article that was out there in 2018. There was one in 2023. It's really looking at how do you create applications that are, getting the proper diagnosis with, fewer false positive as well as false negatives. And you have the link if you want to learn more. But I thought it was fascinating that, the detection is getting so sophisticated that you're able to do this in different types of tissues, even complex tissues. As far as enhancing patient care, we talked about chatbots. So Babylon Health AI chatbot has an application that they're running. They've been running this for a while, which is really interesting that they were looking at the data for the past few years, and this chatbot is accessible 24/7. That a lot of the individuals really like that type of interaction or having access to asking questions or getting routed pretty quickly. So this has been used, for the past few years, and the results are pretty amazing that the routing has not only reduced costs, but also has enhanced patient outcomes as well. So there's, that there is validity in actually having these applications in practice. The other example is Tempus. It's a company that utilizes AI to analyze vast amounts of genomic and clinical data. And again, this is for cancer treatment. As you can see, that's sort of like my area of interest. So it includes identifying potential clinical trial opportunities as well, and coming up with different types of treatment plans for cancer patients. So recently, they have a partnership with Geisinger. So Tempus partnership with this other lab used patients' electrocardiogram readings to determine if a patient had a structural heart disease or atrial fibrillation. And what's really interesting was that it was FDA approved, which I thought it was kind of fascinating that now you could, go to the doctor and have a treatment that, it's an AI-based treatment that's approved, so like doctor is going to give you an AI-based treatment. And this is definitely in clinical trials right now, but it's in an early process as far as FDA approval. So let's talk about healthcare administration. That's the universe that I currently live in. How many of you love going to hospitals? Raise of hands. Only 1%. How many hate going to the hospital? I think all of us hate going to the hospital, me included. So if I could have a chatbot or something else that could mitigate altogether me entering a hospital, I'm all there. But, they're definitely a necessity for complex issues. So really thinking about our healthcare system and thinking about the opportunity of how can we have these technologies improve the way we interact with these healthcare systems, I think there's a lot of opportunities here. Thinking about hospital resource allocation, during COVID, we had a shortage of a lot of nurses that we had a really hard time kind of filling not only roles, but ensuring that the individuals that we had within hospital systems were properly allocated based on need. So I think there's opportunity there. Automated decision-making for clinical decision support in hospitals. As a clinician, I'll have to sit there and read a large, patient file. I don't have time to look at, 5 or 10-year history of a patient. And what would be really great is to have that summary as far as what is the current symptomology, what does the past look like, and what are the critical issues that I need to address. And for a lot of physicians, especially the ones, we're living in the world of managed care, having that information at hand, I think is absolutely important. Reduction of medical errors, I think this is another area. You've seen those stories where they operated on the wrong hand, removed, another part. I mean, those are egregious sort of issues. But I think reduction of simple medical errors is really important as well. So I always think of like Atul Gawande. He's at Harvard. He's a surgeon. And he wrote a book. It's called The Checklist Manifesto. And the whole thing was really thinking about how do you, take sort of FAA, what we do in the airline industry, and apply it to healthcare. And how do you do that systematically? So recently he was talking about how can we bring technologies to the healthcare sectors in reducing medical errors. So I think that's another really good example where these technologies can not only help but also support a clinical decision making and reduction of medical errors. With electronic health record, there's vast amounts of data. How do you manage that? It's really hard for an individual to do. So having systems that support that, I think it's definitely important. Triage and diagnosis is, obviously pretty much a staple right now with having these applications, not only monitor but also support. But what's really interesting, especially with the current work that's happening in the healthcare sector, is really chronic disease management, kind of supporting individuals with different types of diseases like diabetes, heart conditions, COPD. And how do you have sort of like a support AI chatbot application that can help you remember to take your medication, remember to exercise, which I fail to do all the time, as well as do much more self-care. And I love that you guys kind of focused on self-care even during this conference. I think that's really important, as well as prevention and wellness components, and obviously tailored treatment plans. So my colleagues at Mount Sinai, we're looking at pretty much how do we take all of the AHR data that they have and use it to improve patient outcomes. So as I mentioned prior, my husband was originally at Mount Sinai and then ended up going to Memorial Sloan Kettering. And I thought about all of the vast volumes of data, especially within the EHR. And then they did a study recently where they looked at, I think they had over 700,000 patient records, and they segmented that into 76 different types of disease categories. And then based on those disease categories, they were looking at patient outcomes and seeing, is there a way to intervene within that clinical pathway? And what they found is that there are definitely different types of decision points that the clinicians as well as the physicians can do that can definitely change the trajectory of individual patients. So I thought that was pretty novel for a large organization, really thinking about how can we use our data, including the current technologies, to improve patient outcomes. So what are the current emerging trends within the healthcare sector? I love this image my daughter sent me to me recently. She's like, I don't need a human person. We could have a digital person see you, which is kind of scary that there's so many avatars out there that this is where healthcare is going. But this is where healthcare is going. So definitely, AI is paving a way for predictive healthcare and early detection of disease prediction. What's really interesting, especially now with post-COVID, that we've seen the rise of telehealth, telemedicine, and patient remote monitoring, and we're seeing the integration of AI within these applications. AI-driven healthcare chatbots. There's WooBid for mental health. There's plenty of other chatbot types of applications for mental health. And it uses sentiment analysis and voice inflection to determine if an individual has depression, anxiety, and is being used to actually treat many other types of condition, or not only treat, but identify those conditions and refer to a mental health professional. And I think within, especially the mental health field, we're going to see much more proliferation of these types of technologies to improve our mental health and well-being. And there's a couple of examples that I also want to touch base on. One is the blockchain. I think it's going to be important as we're, especially in the healthcare sector, to ensure that we're securely storing our data, managing our health records securely, and enhancing the data exchange to allow for comprehensive data and treatment. Another important role of AI has been in the drug discovery phase, personalized medicine with CRISPR and biotechnology, robotics and surgery. We've seen that robots, including AI combination to train both physicians as well as during surgery, has been important to improve outcomes. But within the drug discovery, we're seeing some really novel research here. And in the drug discovery phase, we're seeing AI being used in drug design, coming up with different types of 3D molecular structures. AI in polypharmacology, looking at different types of biospecific molecules, or looking at different types of counterindications with medication. We're looking at advancements in chemical synthesis, sort of looking at different types of reactions based on different medications, repurposing different drugs. And the good example is that, Viagra was designed for a heart condition. It gets used for something else. Same thing for different types of mental health conditions, as well as different medications being repurposed for other things. In AI and drug screening, I think, prediction of toxicity is going to be key moving forward. I was looking at an article that a colleague of mine sent recently as far as how do we, and the title is like AI can help speed up drug discovery, but only if we give it the right data. So I'm sure during the conference we talked about the issues as far as the privacy, confidentiality. So having the right data is key, especially in healthcare, and representative data. So healthcare is fraught with regulations, and rightfully so. We want to ensure that our data is secure, it's private, but the lack of interoperability, being able to share data across systems is a big challenge for us. So I ended up, as I mentioned, I went to one hospital with my husband, and I had to do a whole set of analysis, ended up going to another hospital, and at that time, they required me to take an actual CD of his results in radiology and move it to another hospital. And we had to start that process all over again. And I just wanted to wreck my brain. I'm like, this system is broken. I'm doing the same thing, replicating it over and over and over again. But each time you have variation as far as what you share across those different systems. So you're going to have gaps in care. Wouldn't it be great to have an interoperable system where, and I'm not a proponent of putting chips in people and just having them scan throughout, but in light of that, I think it's important to have data follow the patient across the board, especially across the health care network. That way, you're able to provide comprehensive care, but you could also see the types of treatments that patient had during their pathways as far as getting treatment. Confidentiality is key. Another thing that I always think about is I usually sign those HIPAA privacy agreements each time I go to the doctor, and I never know if my data is going to be used upstream differently. I know I'm signing for a consent right now to get treatment, but you have no control, U.S. does not have GDPR the same way the Europeans do. That we're not really sure as far as, can this data be de-anonymized and used differently from what I originally intended. So ethics, we're going to touch on that, is going to be important. This is sort of my spiel as far as, especially in healthcare, is highly regulated, just like finance. So the ethical regulatory considerations are not going away. And I think they're going to expand even further as these technologies are coming to the fore. And there's plenty of complex ethical considerations, especially in the healthcare sector. You want to ensure that patients get the best optimal care, but in a way that minimizes risk. So what is within the health and ethics and the regulations realm? In 2016, we see, proliferation since 2016 to 2020 and beyond. There is a new map that goes to 2023, which I was not able to get. So this is from World Health Organization, kind of looking at across the spectrum, who's doing work in regulations within the AI sector. And what's really interesting is that since 2016, we're looking at organizations as well as international bodies thinking about AI and its impact within healthcare in a larger domain as well. So in 2017, AI regulations in healthcare space began with countries such as Singapore that initially outlined AI use, followed right after by China. So the US came into the game, I think, in 2019, from what I could see here. So we're late in the game as far as really thinking about the impact of these technologies. But also really interesting with this agreement, especially with the US outline, that really didn't specify the ethical use of AI in the 2019 document. Another important document that I think is really important, really thinking about AI in healthcare and getting guidelines around what is the appropriate use. So UNESCO member state adopted the first ever global agreement on ethics of AI in 2021 and included 193 member states. And their goal really with this document is to lay the foundation how these technologies get used across different sectors, healthcare included. So their goal was to protect and promote human rights, human dignity, and to serve as an ethical guiding compass and a global normative bedrock to build strong respect for the rule of law in the digital world. A lot of words. I'm not a lawyer. But when I read that, I really think about that this is a first attempt, across the board with multiple member and nation state to think about the ethics of these types of applications. The US has done some interesting work in the past, actually since 2020, where then in 2020 they created the National AI Initiative Act, and then later on the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative. So the AI strategy was being developed by the US and really at the, thinking about how do we develop trustworthy AI? So I think that's really important, including, how do we have trustworthy AI in the public as well as private sectors? A colleague of mine, Lisa, in 2022 went even further ahead, and this is an executive order that differentiates between not only trustworthy AI, but ethical use of AI. And this is going to be really important for healthcare, the differentiation between those. Trustworthy versus ethical. And there's, when I was like, aren't they the same thing? She's like, no, they're not. There's, nuance and variation between those, that terminology. So this mandate actually not only outlines that, but also helps a lot of the organization in this sectors think about how do you do both, especially in healthcare. Another really interesting study was and this is from Stanford, the original Asimov, and later on looking at the 100-year study on artificial intelligence study panel report, also considers, how do these advancements impact not only society, but also individuals and individual choice and rights. And how do we advancements in AI technology can impact daily life around the globe as well as in the US? What are the ethical considerations, especially for individuals and society as a whole? And in this study panel, I think it's really interesting that they look at not only individuals, but individuals within their communities as well as society combined. It has a multidimensional approach by looking at how these technologies impact not only the US, but also globally. So as far as ethical considerations, data privacy and consent are paramount within the healthcare sector. Thinking about fairness and transparency. So IBM has the IBM Fairness Toolkit that I often use. It's open source, so anyone can go and look at it. And it was designed by developers and data scientists like yourselves to mitigate bias in AI. And we've heard all of the stories as far as different types of biases. And that has to do a lot with the data that we have. I was having a conversation recently with a colleague of mine, especially with OpenAI kind of opening it up and having, these algorithms learn from the internet. And the conversation kind of revolved around, thinking about what do we have out in the web? We have documents, but we also have hopes and dreams and our wishes and our biases, a lot of our biases. So how do we train this system, especially in the healthcare sector, to be less biased because we want to provide comprehensive care to everybody, irrespective of creed, irrespective of differences. And that's where I think regulatory guidance for healthcare is going to be key, not to deter development, but to enhance patient rights and well-being. So regarding Ethical and legal considerations that I talked about, trustworthy versus ethical AI. When we think about ethical AI in the context of healthcare, we were thinking about regulation, privacy, so if privacy, consent, mitigation of bias, it's key, transparency, as well as relevance of these applications. On the legal side is the other side of the coin. We're thinking about governance, confidentiality, liability. We want to mitigate all of the lawsuits out there, or potential lawsuits. Accuracy, we want to ensure that these applications are accurate, and they support decision-making. Obviously, limiting bias as much as possible. This is a fairly recent document by the World Health Organization, and furthermore, really talking about ethics and governance based on the previous slide. The World Health Organization came up with 6 different principles that they think every single application or anyone that will be developing systems that impact healthcare need to have. So in their governance, as far as AI regulations, the first principle is really protect human autonomy. Patients, need to control their healthcare journey, that it's not being controlled by system, but they need to have that right. Promote human well-being and safety. I think that's important. So safety and accuracy and efficiency. Ensuring transparency, explainability, and intelligibility. I think those are also important components. Fostering responsibility, ensuring inclusiveness, and promoting AI that is responsible and sustainable. I thought that was really interesting. I never think about the sustainability aspect. I think individuals here that are working within the environmental sector think about the environmental consequences about training these models and the resources that are being used. Especially that we have so many limited resources that we're using these appropriately. The other one that I always think about is inclusiveness and equity. We're designing systems that provide access to everybody, irrespective of age, gender, or orientation. I think it's important. And transparency, I think we want to design systems that are transparent. In light of that, this is another policy, and this is in 2022 by American Medical Association, came right after the World Health Organization. And what's really interesting here is that the American Medical Association, in their titles, says, augmented intelligence in healthcare. And a colleague of mine was mentioning that specifically was used in there instead of artificial intelligence for healthcare, augmented intelligence. So as I started my journey within the healthcare sector, thinking about how can we augment decision-making of clinicians and supporting them rather than replacing them. So I think that was a strategic case of word use. So what they really outline in this document is that AI systems need to be built with patients in mind, which I thought was really important, and keeping best practices and user-centered design. So what they would like to do, and what they are big proponents of, is really having user-centered design. So patients as well as physicians being involved right from the get-go to create different applications that will impact them in the end. So when we think about ethics, and this is an article on machine learning in medicine, sort of, what are the different considerations, including addressing some of the ethical challenges. So ethical use of AI requires us to consider multiple issues, right? How do we source the data? How is the data sourced? Do we always know how your data gets sourced? Raise your hand. Yes, you do, great. Is everybody as confident they know that, how your data gets sourced? Upstream, when you aggregate a lot of that information, you might not know how that data gets sourced. It's really important to understand the lineage of that data. The data lineage is really important because it's going to, especially as a researcher like myself, I want to have control as far as how I collect the data. What types of psychometric instruments I use. What does that look like upstream? How will the data get anonymized? What will it look like if it's get integrated with other types of data sources? There was a study at MIT where it was pretty easy to kind of de-anonymize the data and identify, who the individuals are. So we're seeing some of that with AI, trying to figure out how do we do this better in ensuring that we're doing the right things with data sourcing. The second one that I think about is that how do we develop products and AI applications that really have the concept of beneficence. So in research as well as medicine, you sign the Hippocratic Oath or you attest to the Hippocratic Oath, you want to do the right thing. You don't want to do the wrong thing. So you're hoping to mitigate unintended consequences, which is really hard to do sometimes. So it's really important for us to think about how we're designing these products, who are we designing these products for, and what would the uptake be? And then the last one, I think, is that really thinking about how are they going to be implemented within the clinical settings. We have this, awesome system that we're designing, a chatbot. How will that be integrated with their hospital system, with a larger healthcare network? And what would the applications of the implementation look like? What would the adoption? I think of Roger's theory of innovation, and you have the laggards and the early adopters. We want to have a consistent implementation because obviously these systems, cost money. So there's multiple things that we need to think about when we are implementing these types of technologies within the healthcare sector. So, we're coming towards the end. I want to talk about some of the lessons learned and some of the things that I've seen within the healthcare sector. The development of AI applications are laden with what my daughter says, AI gone wrong. And then, there's, case examples of Tesla where they had the autopilot failure and the car crashed. You have Amazon AI. They created a recruiting platform that showed bias against women and just bias across the board. The other one was the Microsoft AI chatbot called Tay in 2016 that became xenophobic, homophobic, anyphobic, down the line. Good intentions, right? They wanted to create a chatbot that, provided answers. It learned pretty quickly, became really negative. They had to yank it pretty quickly in 2016. This is pretty interesting, a colleague of mine shared. There was a French health chatbot, and it was designed primarily for mental health, but towards the end, it was suggesting suicide to patients. Obviously, that one really wrong. It had to be yanked pretty quickly. And then obviously we've seen other type of healthcare algorithms that fail to flag, especially with marginalized populations. In this case, it was African-American patients with high risk of COPD needing care management, that they were not getting those types of treatments. It was removing them. And that had a lot to do with the representation within the data sets. It was not included within algorithm development, and therefore the treatment was not effective in capturing or providing treatment to those types of populations. So it's really important when you think about the development, how do we create systems and processes that are ethical, have the concept of beneficence, that kind of look at the entire swath of the populations and provide optimal treatment irrespective of who you are, what your social position is. And having patient-centered care that really focuses on you as an individual, I think, is really key. And some of these technologies are doing quite a lot of work here and will definitely benefit us there. As I mentioned prior, there's plenty of regulatory challenges and opportunities. And I encourage each of you to embrace the ethical standards and kind of look at how do regulation, not as I usually think of regulation as a hindrance, but recently I'm learning to accept and love regulations as my friend. It's hard to do. Another thing that I like to talk about is techno-solutionism, is that AI will not address social issues or every single healthcare issue, that we should not be using technology for everything. And sometimes the human factor is really important. So having a technological solution for something that's not applicable, it's okay to say, maybe this doesn't apply in this context. So separating contexts where we could apply technology in other parts where it needs more of a human touch. And really thinking about the disinformation that we've seen now with deepfakes and many other things. A colleague of mine is working this area, thinking, how will this apply to the healthcare sector? And then thinking about the risk in medical setting, I think recently 23andMe had a pretty large breach of genomic data, which I thought it was kind of interesting. Why would the hackers go after genomic data? And I think it's going something like $1,000 on the web, which is kind of frightening. But in a way, this makes us think about what is the role of this type of data, especially healthcare data, what is the value of that in the field? And really thinking about how do we mitigate mitigate that risk. And obviously, I talked about AI inequality. I inserted 2 different slides here regarding commercialization in AI healthcare. It's something for you to think about as far as who is actually doing majority of the work in the private, public partnerships, as well as private equity, as research partnerships within your organization, within the technology, the pharmaceutical companies, and the insurance companies, and how each of those systems interrelate. I'm going back to the 100-year study on artificial intelligence that I shared based on the Asimov from Stanford. They have a line on page 45 that I thought was really interesting. And they say that as the line between academic and industry research in AI blurs, so they're talking about those types of commercialization partnership, additional social and ethical issues come to the fore. I think that's really important to really think about and examine those relationships. And they also advocate for, having really effective policies right off the bat, to kind of outline that academic industry collaboration. So when I think of responsible use of AI in healthcare, I'm thinking of applications that promote health, prioritize ethics, contextualize, especially, enhancing trust, focus on, individual rights and autonomous agents, develop and deploy applications that are appropriately trained with appropriate educational programs, and use best frameworks and implementation science, whatever implementation science has to offer for the uptakes of these technologies. And another really important thing is balancing innovation and safety, especially in healthcare. I think that's paramount. So obviously in, any sort of AI applications, but also within healthcare, sector, we want to ensure that there's no miracle happening. We hear, it's a miracle of cancer, and sometimes, I'm much more of a skeptic, where I'm like, well, what does the treatment look like, and what does the outcome look like? But having systems that are transparent, explainable, interpretable, and provable, I think it's important. Having each of those. We need to understand, how do we reach conclusions? I need to understand, how is the algorithm making decision points? What do the decision pathways look like? And that's the only way for us to understand and triage if something goes wrong. And I think it's really important to have, as far as the future of explainability, building databases that include explanations of data and context. So what does the future look like? And so this is sort of towards the end. The research, especially with quantum computing, going from analog to digital to qubits, and I'm not a quantum mechanic, but it's interesting, some of the research there. Neuromorphic hardware, sort of, engineering the digital human brain, a lot of work that's happening there. Affective computing, there's a colleague of mine, Rosalind Pigard at MIT Media Lab, that's doing some really interesting work with Affectiva, kind of looking at microexpressions and having systems designed that are able to pick up those microexpressions. And the goal of that is that if we're able to read those expressions, we could design systems that can relate very differently, especially with individuals with autism, creating interventions in that realm. And this applies also with real-time face and voice recognition as well, that we're doing some really interesting work here to simulate human affect and have chatbots that are, much more real. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here and to talk about some of the amazing work within the AI, especially within the healthcare sector. And I implore each of you to sort of explore what's out there. And like I said prior, there's plenty of funding opportunity in this sector. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That was so wonderful. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, I don't know if I should let you go first. All right.
Just a question on your experience in healthcare administration,
Yeah.
And your personal experience of moving data across. Are the different large hospital systems working on sharing, like accepting one another's data? Because an anecdote I have is someone having to go through very invasive testing all over again because one large research hospital system would not take the tests from another. So is that something that's being worked?
It's being worked on now. I think from my personal experience, my experience wasn't like that. This was 7 years ago that, having data from one hospital system to another hospital system was a challenge, and largely because of the systems were not set in a way to share the data. Right now, I think almost all of them, like the big kahunas like Epic and Cerner, there's a conglomeration. So it's easier to share messages and easier to share data now than it was 7 years ago. But we're seeing much more work in having that interoperability framework. And there's plenty of people way smarter than me that are working on that right now to move data across healthcare systems and have that data follow the patient across that treatment platform.
I saw other questions. I'm just going to work my way that way. Then I have to run so far.
So I'm going to piggyback on that question.
Sure.
Because you mentioned interoperability.
Yes.
And if we look, for example, at immunology, last year there were over 100,000 manuscripts published just in the field of immunology, and each one of those come with a data set.
Correct.
And they come in different formats. It's extremely difficult to harmonize data, and once we start moving with multimodal data, images, and health records, it becomes much more challenging. So this summer I had the opportunity to engage with a number of people discussing this, and it seems like the consensus is AI will take care of it, will harmonize it for you. And I was like, I don't see how is that happening. So what is your insight on what is the future of data harmonization, crossing boundaries? What do we have to do? Set standards for everybody, or let AI write this train?
I'm the old traditional person. I mean, I've done plenty of data analysis in my past life where you have to clean the data, scrub the data before, and I've never seen any application that is just going to miraculously get you to whatever you need. AI is a tool. I just think of this as like a stethoscope, like as a physician, it's just another tool, but I don't think it's just going to take the human out of that loop. It's another tool that's going to help you get your job done faster, but is it going to mitigate or take you out of a job? I don't think so. As far as harmonization, I think these tools definitely will help, but having some sort of common standard where we all agree, I think is going to be important in order to be able to share data, and especially immunology data as well.
Where are we with the standard?
So it's interesting because regulations and standards are lacking. That's one of the things that technology kind of moves forward, like 2 decades. And as you saw from my, presentation, we started thinking about regulations and coding this in 2016, which is so. And then within, really thinking since 1950s, a lot of these technologies had started, being built. But from the 1950s to 2016, that's a huge lag as far as regulation. I think we've seen a crescendo and including an increase right now that it's at the fore of everybody's mind, that we're really thinking about how do these applications apply in our real life. But the regulations take a long time to catch up, unfortunately. And we're relying on companies like Google, Meta, to create those ethical guidelines, including Tesla. You had Elon Musk like 5 minutes away when I was at the state. But should we rely on these technologies, on these corporations to come up with those standards? Or we as a collective society, and every one of you really needs to think about how do we do that collectively?
Serpentine.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm Zach Kiloffer. I'm from the U of I. I'm a PhD student there. There was one slide that you had, I think it was Babylon's healthcare chatbot.
Yes.
And I was looking at this, and the question said something like, do you have dizziness? And then it had a couple of possible responses that were, I think, no, yes, it came on suddenly, or yes, it came on gradually. And in my economist brain, I was thinking that's not really great survey practice. There should probably be other options like, I'm not really sure, or does wooziness count as dizziness? What do you mean by dizziness, right? Those are things that might come out with an in-person interaction, right? You can kind of follow up and clarify, but you don't really have that option when you have like these kind of forms in this design system. And so I was kind of thinking that there could be issues with maybe the machine learning or the AI of the system where there's accuracy problems, there's bias problems. You could also have just design problems, like sort of human-computer interaction problems where something like this, maybe you just didn't ask the right questions, and so you're forcing someone to give you an answer which is incorrect for them, right? So I was thinking, in the context of healthcare, how do you just assure good systems when you have multiple problems, right? One of them are on the machine learning data backend sort of thing, and the other is on the front end with how humans actually interact with this socio-technical system, right? Is it just a matter of getting the right expertise into the design process, or do you have any best practices that you could recommend in the context of AI systems in healthcare?
I think a lot of these systems were designed by data scientists, individuals outside of healthcare, and that's why the American Medical Association said that, I mean, they are huge proponent of human-centered design and including the physicians in the design process. So in my clinical training, especially in mental health, I know what questions to ask and how to ask them. And also, another thing that we're lacking with a lot of these systems is that the effective assessment. So if I look at you, I'm not only looking at your facial, sort of looking at your face, but you're looking at your position within the 3D environment and assessing you as a whole person. Some of these systems are prima facie, they're just looking at questions and answers. So the design part is going to be important. But with the current research, I think, and MIT is doing some really cool stuff with affective computing, kind of looking at facial recognition, micro expressions. They're getting closer to that with some of these really cool digital assistants. I think we're going to get closer to that. But we do have the problem of, the design of these applications not being as comprehensive. Obviously, there's a cost-benefit analysis of, what can you design and deploy pretty quickly. And a lot of the hospital systems have put a lot of these out there as a way to mitigate the inflow, but also collect initial data. And what they do have is workflows immediately after, to see the patient. But getting sort of like the initial symptomology, I think that's the way that's the way we use the current chatbots. It's not to replace the physician, but to augment that to get the initial information as far as what the issue is, what are you coming in for.
Was there another question over here? We might have time for one or two more. Oh, that's right. I did see your hand, and then I'll get you in.
Thank you for a great talk. I mean, it was very comprehensive in talking about the potential, scope, and the risks of AI in the context of healthcare. My question is from an education point of view, and about the data science AI literacy that you see healthcare professionals, doctors, administrators needing going into the future. Do you think it's more along the lines of professional training to use the tools, understand the risks, or do you see there to be a need for more foundational education conceptual understanding of data science and AI?
See, when I'm in the field of executives, I can't see the governor sitting there learning, like, hey, let's talk about AI, He has a state to run, right? Governor Abbott is not going to sit there and talk about AI, concepts and ideas. But I think in that case is really looking at how these applications can be applied in the field and what the risk and ethical considerations. For executives, I think that is the mindset. And I think education is one step down to the individuals that will be actually using these applications for them to understand the nuance as far as what they're looking at, your operations, your managers, folks, to really have a data literacy and a data science understanding as far as if we're going to implement this, what will it look like? I think for the senior executives is really understanding the safety and risk of these, applications, if they do deploy that in their setting, and what does that look like? I think there is different mindset depending on, where you are, and your perspective will vary as well.
Thank you.
So I think the literacy part, I would love to have executives, sit through like a whole lecture on data science, but based on their time, I don't think they're going to do that.
Okay, one more question, then we will let you go.
Thank you. So fascinating talk. My question is more towards, as we see AI coming into the sort of healthcare practice, how do we see the shift between patient and healthcare providers sort of shifting? Do we see AI sort of becoming where are we positioning AI in this sort of, relation that existed between patient, institutions of healthcare, healthcare providers? I mean, data always nurtures a form of relational dynamic. So how do we see that shifting? And I personally really, study depression disclosure. That's something that I also sort of like to dabble in. So, if I'm talking to a chatbot, what what should I know? What should the healthcare provider know? What should so, there's this whole relational fabric that existed traditionally, and now AI coming into the mix is going to change that. So what do we see in terms of that, especially if we think about things like, explainability, ethics? What does that whole sort of, dynamic mean as we move into this age of AI? Thank you. That's my question.
That is a fascinating question. Sort of having, like two is a crowd, three, I think two is a part, I don't know how that goes, but having another person, not a person, but another system in there that can decision. I think it's fascinating. For me, when I think of these applications, I see them as tools rather than kind of replacing that interaction. So in my case, if I'm seeing a patient, I only have a limited amount of time. So if I could have another application in there that can capture whatever, sort of basic, demographic, other types of information that I would need, or symptomology, I see that as a tool that I don't have to do. And then I could concentrate, spend my time doing other things. And I don't think that AI is going to replace, clinicians, physicians. Even I was at a conference where I'm like, somebody was mentioning that, well, AI is going to get rid of all the radiologists out there. We don't need any more radiologists. I don't think that, that's what we want to do. I mean, definitely that's a tool in their toolbox to look at patterns, but I think their role is going to change. And I think, especially with me and many others in the healthcare sector, our role will shift slightly, but I don't think that, it's going to replace. I think it's going to be augmenting, the work that we do. And I think I welcome that, especially with my fallible memory and just many other things I have to remember. Having a system that never forgets is definitely helpful. Having a system that can, look at volumes of data and, summarize, absolutely, love it. And that helps me focus on here and now with having that summary, what else do I need to do in this treatment and plan and approach? That's what I think the technology will kind of look like in the healthcare sectors. There's plenty of skeptics out there, sort of like our old-time physicians. They're like, like these technologies, I rely on my clinical expertise. But just with, your phones, I mean, I rely on Google Maps. I was mentioning my daughter, I'm like, in the olden days, we had to print out maps like MapQuest, and actually, like, put a line out there. That now we just, rely on these systems, and hopefully the systems are correct, and there's, no road closures or hurricanes. It's pretty accurate. So as long as it gets me to the right path, I'm happy with it.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Besa Bauta one more time.